Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Karen, for that introduction. It's great to be back here. As Karen noted, I did my PhD at SFU, but I spent more time at UBC as a result of my supervisor going on maternity leave and then moving across the country, and my other supervisor retiring. So I ended up spending most of my time here at UBC, and that was 15 years ago. So campus has changed significantly since I was last here, but at least this building and the building next door are still the same. So I was able to find my way around. And yeah, I'll be starting at University of Victoria on May 1st, and I'm really excited about that move. I've been thinking about coming back to the West Coast ever since my grad school days here, and so I'm quite excited to join all of you West Coasters once more. All right, so basically, my research objective as a person in HCI is to design, develop, and evaluate novel technologies that improve the social, cognitive, and effective well-being of people. And as suggested by the picture underneath, in the last decade, I've focused the majority of my research on technologies related to games and gaming, asking the big audacious question of how can we harness the motivational pull of games to benefit people? So this is basically the question that guides most of my work. And the fact that I want my work to benefit people rather than harm them just means that I'm not some sort of evil Disney villain. So the more interesting part, I think, of this for today is why games? And this is normally the point at which I would try and convince my audience that games are a cultural artifact worthy of study, which translates into please publish my work, or that, you know, the economic advantages afforded by the gaming industry is necessary for, you know, Canadian opportunity, which basically translates into please fund my work. But I feel like I'm among academic friends who both want to see my work funded and published. So I'm going to take the next 45 minutes to try and convey why games. Why study games? Are they not just toys? Are they frivolous media experiences for kids, or are they more? And so for some of you, it's going to be a little bit scary. Who here plays games? Okay, generational divide. So for those of you that don't, some of it might be a little scary. So I'm going to ease into it with the easy stuff, which is the first thing is money. So as you may know, the global games market generated revenues of over 175 billion in 2020, and it's only been growing since then in terms of people turning to games during the pandemic years. Consumers spend more on games than they do on movies and music combined, but games are more than just a fun leisure activity. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of esports. Esports refers to organized and competitive gaming, and 500 million people in the world are fans. Esports revenues were 25 billion in 2020, and the largest esports prize pool to date, which was a Dota tournament, is comparable to the prize pool for Wimbledon. Kids can go to college on an esports scholarship. They can make a career out of it. The Olympic Council of Asia is including esports as a medal sport in the Asian Games of 2022, which are actually happening in 2023, but it's being included in the Olympics for the first time. And so most of you might still feel comfortable here. We know that entertainment is business, it makes money, and we get it, but it also gets scarier. This is a picture of my kids visiting their cousins in Vancouver a few years ago. I guess here in Vancouver. They only met a handful of times at this point, and they'd only met for a short time. And this shows what's somewhat typical of kids these days. Over 90% of young people play games, and the average young person racks up about 10,000 hours of gaming by the age of 21. You may recognize this number. It's that magical number of hours that Anders Ericsson's studies show that virtuoso musicians spent practicing. And you may recognize it as it was popularized and maybe oversimplified by Malcolm Gladwell, talking about expertise. But regardless of what you think about Malcolm Gladwell and his work, this does imply that the average young person is basically a virtuoso in gaming by the time they're 21. So are you scared yet? These kids are the future leaders of our countries. Well, maybe not these kids, but you get the idea. Like, they'll one day kind of build our planes that we fly in. They'll do my hip surgeries when I get old. They'll make the new laws that govern our country, you know, this next generation. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking that these stats are a little bit horrifying. What will a future society run by people who spent so many hours gaming look like? You're thinking perhaps of some of the negative stereotypes of gamers, and you might be thinking perhaps of someone like Jenkins. So this is the griefer from the Make Love, Not Warcraft episode of South Park. His name is Jenkins. He does a really good job of embodying a number of common stereotypes that we have about gamers. He looks a little bit lazy. He's got energy drinks beside him. You know, he might be wearing an astronaut diaper so that he doesn't have to take breaks from his, you know, gains and his wins to deal with basic biology. So as a researcher and as a parent, I had to think, are these stereotypes founded? Does that 175 billion in revenue come at a great cost to society? Do I have to worry that this gamer will turn into this gamer? And really, are we being a bit judgy if we just assume that Jenkins' life is somehow not fulfilling because we form some notion of what it means to be happy? Are all these negative stereotypes just stereotypes? So I wanted to pause for a second and ask the question, do we, really need to have social interactions? Or was that just for our hunter-gatherer ancestors who needed each other to survive the mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and ancient droughts and pestilences and other things? Why do we need social connections? Well, we all know that there's some importance of social satisfaction for our well-being, health, depression, combating addiction, etc. When people feel socially ostracized, there are measurable and harmful effects on how they interpret the world around them. Ambiguous information that comes at them is perceived as more hostile if they're lonelier. The world basically becomes a darker and more threatening place. And recent studies have even shown those who live alone or who feel socially isolated have a 30% increase in a risk of mortality. And although Canada is at the top of global rankings for economic and social progress indicators, the rate of mental illness and loneliness in Canada is higher than world averages. You can't really read this from where you are, but this is the OECD Better Life Index. This is Canada. The up arrows indicate positive change over the last decade. The flat arrows indicate no change, and the down arrow indicates decline. So basically, the only thing you need to take away from this is that although our earnings are upper in Canada, and a changing labor market might mean less job certainty, everything else in Canada is going up, except social connectedness. It is a singular thing that has gone down in the Better Life Index of Canada. All the other social indicators have risen in Canada over the last decade, but social connectedness has declined, with levels of loneliness rising to new highs. The situation is similar in the other kind of countries like the UK, the US, and the rest of the EU. So much so that in the UK, they actually installed a minister of loneliness in the government in 2018. These data are from a few years back, but since the COVID pandemic began, the situation has actually become even more worse. This is a BBC article from last week. And if you can't read the headline, it says, okay, because it's underneath the Zoom thing, it says, can Gen Z make friends in the pandemic era? It's fine, don't worry about it. Yeah, it's fine, don't worry about it. And the article, which was on the BBC, was basically about the idea that Gen Zers are having trouble making friends because traditionally we make friends at school and in the workplace, and they're not going there. They're working remotely. They're doing knowledge work from home a lot, and levels of loneliness are actually at an all-time high for that generation as well. Good social support can make you more resilient to depression, where loneliness can facilitate, or where loneliness facilitates depression. Basically, isolation and rejection are harmful because they thwart our fundamental need to belong to something. And games and play have actually always been an important part of combating this. This picture above that you see here is the well-known Renaissance painting Children's Games by Peter Bruegel, a Flemish painter. It was finished in 1560 and depicts a bunch of Flemish children's activities. It shows over 200 children engaging in 91 different playful activities. And because of its thorough depiction, it's often considered to be an illustrated encyclopedia of children's games of that period. At least 36 of the activities has been identified as games, things like touch tag, blind man's bluff, and lawn bowls. And the rest of the identified games are still played by children today, having been passed on for 450 years. And it's astonishing that these 36 games have survived that long, but what's even more interesting to me is something else that stands out about every single one of them. All of them would be considered multiplayer games. So games have long been used to support social satisfaction, to support social interaction. I'm not a historian, but I do know that board games, dice games, tile games, and sports go way back. And more recently, things like family board game nights, tabletop gaming and board game stores, weekly poker games among friends can help satisfy our need for relatedness and create shared experiences that draw us closer together. People play on recreational sports teams, which might also be about keeping in shape physically, but people also do things like pub trivia. They play chess in the park, they play pool in the bar, and these playful social activities are moving into digital spaces at a rapid pace. Some of you may recognize Fortnite. Digital games are being increasingly used to help form and maintain social relationships, both in homes and in gaming bars and online. They have the additional advantage of assisting people who don't live together, who are distributed, maintain social connections. Siblings who've gone off to different colleges can play Fortnite together online. Parents play Words with Friends with their kids who move out of home. College friends who move to different cities can play Destiny together each Sunday. The Entertainment Software Association reports that in 2022, the majority of gamers played in multiplayer mode because they felt like video games helped them connect with their friends. Multiplayer co-op modes are becoming increasingly common, and people are spending a majority of their time gaming, playing with others. So there are a couple of questions that arise out of this whole context that I've just presented. Obviously, do games satisfy our need for social connection? Do digital games when they're played online? And how much is the efficacy of games compromised when we move them online or replace face-to-face conversation with audio or even text chat, or basically game moves themselves? These are an important number of questions and part of what I've been working on with my students and colleagues over the past 15 years. So let's get into it. First question, how can we enact existing relationships through games? I have a lot of work in this topic, but I'm just going to give you 2 examples using the very young and the very old. This is a long ago project where we created small games for pre-literate children, babies to 4 years old, that run in a transparent window on top of Skype. And this is because if you've ever interacted with a kid, you should know that you don't try and have a conversation with them, like how was your day at daycare? It's not something that plays well with a 3-year-old. So through this game, we aim to connect families with young children who live apart and make them feel closer, not more isolated. This project was in collaboration with Microsoft Research and Sesame Street. And we also extended the work to support intimacy between romantic couples who are distributed, which was also in collaboration with Microsoft, but did not involve Sesame Street because that's not really their basic demographic. This is the same approach that we took to support older adults who required caregiving support from family members. This was work done by PhD student Kat Gerling. These were spouses, parents taking care of their kids, and kids taking care of their parents. In these games, we looked at the roles that players took. All of the games were cooperative rather than competitive. And basically what I want you to take away from this is that players felt closer after play. But what was interesting to us is that they felt less burdened by the relationship of care after cooperating to achieve a shared goal through play. So caregivers felt quite burdened by having to take care of their loved ones, but when they were able to play a game together with them and work towards a shared goal, that burden was a little bit alleviated. More recently, we looked at how synchronization over a distance affects feelings of closeness and rapport. This was work done by my PhD student, Raquel Robinson, who spent time actually working here with Karen throughout her PhD. We used the principle of mirroring, which is doing the same movements as somebody else at the same time in an intervention used to support the development of intimacy among dyads. In our case, we had this synchronization being the game mechanic. Players had to synchronize to stay in the middle lane and to duck under obstacles and avoid whirlpools. Instead of motion, though, we used emotions as the input, sensed through breathing in unison, maintaining the same heart rate, and joint action in their facial expressions, which was making a happy face or a look of disgust at the same time to trigger obstacle avoidance. And we showed that players did feel closer as a result. This is a reenactment of something that we did, but we took pictures of the players together before and after the game and had totally different people rate those pictures in terms of how close and happy the players looked. And those who used our embodied game controls were rated as both happier and closer than those who used just a mouse and a keyboard to play the games. And we actually extended this idea into Twitch, which is a streaming platform for games that many of you may be familiar with and have watched before. We developed a survival shooter game that streamers play on Twitch in front of their audience. And the online spectators who are in their homes had their heart rate sensed as they watched the gaming happening through their webcam using computer vision approaches that sense blood flow changes in the forehead. So the heart rates from the spectators who were in their homes were then averaged and used to affect properties in the game, like the difficulty, the lighting, and the environment. We deployed this as an in the wild study with several popular streamers to see if this kind of physiological input could help the streamers and the spectators feel closer or more connected to each other, which it actually did. So we can use games to help maintain existing relationships, but what about using them to form new ones? And why would we even want to do that? And so I'm going to show you another 2 examples from our work in this area around the idea of developing trust. So why am I talking about trust all of a sudden when I've been talking about social connectedness? Well, all of us can probably think back and remember working in a group context and it was just great. Everything was smooth, everyone was contributing, communication was great, things got accomplished. And most of us have probably also experienced the opposite situation. Situations in which team members are bickering, no one really wants to take charge and things start getting a little bit passive aggressive. So where does good teamwork come from? Well, literature and organizational psychology suggests that it has a lot to do with trust. Trust is basically the idea that we're vulnerable and that we rely on others. And it's common for companies to try to help their employees develop trust through team building exercises. For me, the whole like company goes on a retreat and practices trust falls and ropes courses thing seems like something that's like out of a movie. Like that actually literally happened in Pitch Perfect 2 for those of you who might have watched that movie out there. But a couple of years ago, I went to visit my colleagues at Microsoft Research, and while en route, Corey Inkpen texts me to ask if I brought any exercise clothes because one of the days they were doing a team building exercise and she was taking everyone to a ropes course. And that's one of the times when I understood that my life in academia is really different than the life of how things are in industry. But it is relatively common for co-located companies to do this sort of team building exercise. But distributed work environments are becoming increasingly common, especially in these last few pandemic years. And it's really tough to do a trust fall online. Or is it? We felt like games had certain properties that made them a really good candidate for helping distributed teams develop trust. So in this project, my PhD student Ansgar Depping and I compared an online cooperative interdependent game that we created to an online social icebreaker task in terms of how well it helps strangers develop trust on the internet. So this game you may recognize if you're a board gaming fan. It was based on the German board game Labyrinth, and it's cooperative and interdependent game. One player has to navigate the maze, and the other player has to push the walls to create the path to take them there. It involves coordination and it involves communication. The social icebreaker task that we used was a very common thing. It was a prompted series of questions about personal information disclosure. And we asked about people's hobbies, we asked about their vacation preferences, what kinds of pizza toppings they like, and other bits of personal information. And the takeaway is that the game worked much better at facilitating trust than the social icebreaker task. Higher is better in this chart. And the reason that the game, which is the light blue line, was better than the social icebreaker task is that it was robust to things that undermine trust development. So individual factors like a person's overall propensity to trust, their agreeableness, experiential factors like how much they enjoyed the experience. The success of the social icebreaker task was dependent on the experience the people were having and properties of the people themselves. The game was, however, resilient to these individual factors and these differences among people. In a follow-up study, we wanted to really unpack which of the game mechanics worked and why. So we created 4 versions of the Labyrinth game, and we established comparability between them. And we showed how cooperation and interdependence affect different aspects of the player experience. But we confirmed that both of these factors affect the relationship between players outside of the game by affecting the amount of trust that developed between them. So it's not just cooperating that helped build trust, but competing could also build trust as long as the experience was also interdependent. We also extended this work together with an intern at the time, Julian Frommel, by looking at how trust develops between dyads. So again, we had two strangers play this game together online. We gathered features from their conversation, their facial expressions, their eye blink rate, their game performance, their conversational patterns, their tone of voice, that kind of stuff, that effective computing stuff that Karen was mentioning earlier, to see if we could determine how trust forms and also to create machine learning models of developing interpersonal trust. The models worked well, both within classification and regression, but there was still a lot of work that would need to be done in this context. So these examples show how we can use games to form trust in new relationships. And as an aside, there are many other good lessons that we can learn from online social gameplay, like how to survive a moose attack. In 2007, there was a 12-year-old Norwegian boy who was attacked by a moose. And in the article, he described how he first yelled at the moose, distracting it so that his younger sister could get away. And he told the press, I believe this is called taunting, a move one uses in World of Warcraft to get monsters off the less well-armored team members. And then when he got attacked and the animal stood over him, he pretended to be dead. And he said, just like you learn at level 30 of World of Warcraft. So don't let anyone tell you that playing WoW is a waste of time, because it could save your life one day. If you get attacked by a moose when you're in Norway, that could happen. All right, so we know that games work, but how do they work when people have differing interests or abilities? How can we design multiplayer games effectively under these circumstances? And what I'm going to walk through next is a series of, sorry, it's just not responding. It's okay, I'll just use the arrows. So what I'm going to walk through next is a series of studies we did to look at what happens when two people don't have the same abilities. Can we still have these advantages of social games? And what we know is that multiplayer games are fun. However, multiplayer games are not always enjoyable when the skill levels of people are quite different. It isn't fun if one player is destroying everyone else. Losing players become frustrated because the game's too difficult, and the better player becomes disengaged because the game is too easy. There's no suspense when the outcome is certain, which is really not fun for anyone. But it's very hard to balance a game when the challenge of the situation is determined by the skill of another player. The difficulty of the game comes from the opponent, whose behaviors and skills can't be controlled by a system. So we've been conducting multiple lines of research over the past years to address this imbalance. We've used simulated drivers, and other types of games, but I'm just going to walk through a series of studies that we did using a bespoke first-person shooter game. So in this series of papers, we investigated how to use aim assistance to balance multiplayer experiences in a first-person shooter. It's basically like research on Fitts law, but with explosions and headshots, so it's almost exactly the same. Our first paper, which was published at CHI 2014, was led by a master's student who actually moved here, Rodrigo Vicente Moriera, and investigated whether or not aiming assistance could improve performance in a first-person shooter in the context of a single-player game. And we showed that it did. Aim assistance works on a targeting range scenario and a little less effectively when realistic game elements like assault rifles in the presence of friendlies were introduced in a walkthrough map. In our next study, I'm just going to play that again so you can see. In our next study published at CHI 2015, we took these aiming assistance techniques and applied them in a multiplayer scenario in which people competed against an opponent. And in this case, we showed that it worked extremely well again. Aim assistance minimized score differential, and it even worked for pairings when they had very large skill differences, like when you have a novice playing with an expert. It improved, when you assist players, it improves the perception of fairness for the weaker player, but it didn't detract from the perceived fairness of the stronger player. Assistance would improve the weaker player's perception of their own competence, but it didn't really change the stronger player's feeling of competence. And finally, although assistance affected only the weaker player's performance, experienced enjoyment increased for everyone playing the game, for both the weaker player and the stronger player. And you might be thinking, well, that's fine in a toy application, but what happens if the players notice? What happens when you tell people that you're assisting the weaker player? Because when people know, do they feel that it's unfair? Do they feel that you're cheating or being cheated somehow? Because there's reasons to believe that might be the case. Cheating in sports and in games is a long history that we've been looking into. To illustrate, this is a photo of Femke van der Driesche. She was a Belgian cyclist who was disqualified from the World Cyclocross Championship in Belgium for having a motor hidden in her bike that assisted her in the race. The International Cycling Union was outraged, calling this technological fraud. She was banned from the sport for 6 years, and she announced her retirement at the age of 19. And most of us probably hear this and think, well, that's fair. She deserves this because she cheated. But a family bike tour, on the other hand, is a very different matter. If a grandfather wants to use a motor in his bike so that he can keep up with his grandson, he probably won't be banned from family activities for 6 years. So a bike race can be held in two very different settings, a very competitive setting and a very social setting. And the setting determines whether or not we are willing as players to accept assistance. When a friendly bike race between a grandson and a grandfather is mostly a social activity, it can be still competitive in nature. And what we know about competition is that it's most effective when it's balanced. So back to our first-person shooter game, we recruited novice expert pairs and had them compete against each other. And sometimes we disclosed that the weaker player was being assisted. And what do we find? Well, disclosure was not at all harmful. Assistance still increased enjoyment and suspense. Weaker players felt more competent and less tense. There were no negative effects. And so in this study, we started to also look at why. Why was disclosure not harmful? Well, we discussed how engagement in a balanced game is more powerful than disclosure is, and that the game setting of a social activity changes expectations. But plus, there's also this thing that you may be aware of called self-serving attribution bias, in which people attribute success to themselves and failure to external sources. So you might be familiar with this if you've ever tried to publish a paper. And of course, when the reviewers receive it really well, you're like, well, I did a really good job and I'm a very good writer. So obviously they received it well. But if they don't receive it well, it's because reviewer 2 didn't really understand and they don't know what's going on. That's kind of the idea behind self-serving attribution bias. So it worked here too. Assistance still works, even when you tell people you're assisting them. And now some of you may still be skeptical on the value of assistance because maybe you're thinking that assisting people will impede their skill development over time, but we tested that too. In a complex multi-day study involving shooting galleries and many walkthroughs, and I won't go through it, but the takeaway is that assisting players does not impede their skill development. It helps them when they're being assisted, But when you take it away, it didn't affect their learning. And we did this in a first-person shooter environment, and we also did this with navigation tasks as well. And finally, it even worse when we're balancing for extreme differences in skill or ability. This project is an old one, but it looked at combining our work on balancing and some really old work on exergames, and we were effectively balancing exergame between people with very vastly different physical abilities. So we were able to pair an able-bodied person with a person who uses a wheelchair and have them compete in a multiplayer clone of Dance Dance Revolution that uses different balancing algorithms to effectively hide the assistance from the players. In this case, we were using a Microsoft Connect and a custom toolkit that we developed to sense the wheelchair's movements and turn that into input into the Dance Dance Revolution game. So we know that games work to help maintain and build social connections, even when people have really different abilities. But how do they satisfy us and why? So just a couple of recent things. Using structural equation modeling, we looked at the relationships between different aspects of our gaming community, things like that I mentioned before, like interdependence, cooperation, and something new that I'll bring up called toxicity, and how that built social capital in games. And then we looked at how this translated into out-of-game loneliness. So if you're not familiar with social capital, it's a framework that describes the kinds of social relationships that we have built with others. It's divided into two types: bonding social capital, which is kind of those deep, very meaningful connections, and the kind of questions that you would ask to determine bonding social capital are things like, this person would be a good reference for me. This person would share their last dollar with me. So these are very deep relationships. And the other type of social capital is bridging social capital. And it's kind of a widening, I don't know why it's not working. It's kind of a widening type of social capital. So these are questions you would ask, like, this person makes me feel like I'm part of a larger community. They make me want to try new things. So it's kind of this very broad, kind of exposing you to a new world. So these are the two types of social capital. And what we did is we looked at how these two types of social capital are affected by your gaming community and how that translates into out-of-game loneliness. And I don't need to go through the actual structural equation model, but I wanted to highlight two things. Two things that we found that were really interesting to us were that interdependence and toxicity were the important predictors of building social capital, which ultimately combated loneliness. Cooperation wasn't necessary. So just like our previous work, we got this idea that like competition isn't actually necessarily a bad thing for forming social connections. It wasn't really that important in this context as well. And second, we demonstrated that in-game social capital is associated with reduced feelings of loneliness and also increased satisfaction in relationships. So our findings suggest that social capital that people build by playing games can positively relate to their well-being outside of games. And this was a survey study in which people were primed to reflect on their gaming communities, but we also looked at it in specific games. We looked at it in the context of World of Warcraft, where we recruited a bunch of players from forums to answer surveys. We used the Blizzard API to gather their gaming data over a 2-week period and connect that also to these ideas. In this case, instead of just looking at the toxicity and the interdependence of their gaming community, we incorporated the idea of dualistic passion, which is something that we've been looking at as a way to describe your engagement with games. And dualistic passion separates things into two types of passion, or two passion orientations. One is harmonious passion, which is a nice, balanced, authentic passion. It can be very high, but it's still balanced with the rest of your life. And then there's obsessive passion, which is, you know, where it's, if I could, the only thing I would do is play World of Warcraft. I have an obsessive feeling about it, and I think about it all the time. I'm hyper fixated on it, that kind of passion. And what we were able to find, again, using structural equation modeling, is, and I don't need to go through it, but basically harmonious passion builds bridging and bonding social capital, which combats loneliness and ultimately improves well-being. So that balanced, non-authentic passion was really good at building social capital. Obsessive passion also built social capital, but in this case, it didn't combat loneliness and it didn't translate into improved well-being. But obsessive passion did actually directly increase feelings of loneliness. So it isn't just about playing, and it isn't just about how much you play, or what kinds of games you play. It's a very complex set of factors that have to do with the context of your life, who you're playing with, what kind of social capital you're building, and what your passion orientation is. And we've confirmed the same pattern of findings in recent papers, both before and during the pandemic, within multiple game genres. We've looked at MOBAs, role-playing games, and FPS games as well. But so basically what we found overall throughout all these studies is that our in-game relationships have out-of-game benefits to the people who play them. And finally, we've extended beyond what you might consider as typical digital games in a recent investigation to how playing pinball supports men's mental well-being. This study was funded by Movember Foundation, and so we were focused on male players. And it was really interesting as we learned a lot about how playing together, shoulder to shoulder in a pinball context, helped the men in our study feel connected to others, and how it helped them be more able to disclose personal information and gather social support from their buddies in ways that weren't accessible to them just by sitting around kind of facing each other, sharing a drink. So it's been kind of a very interesting study to look at because it isn't a digital environment necessarily, but that idea that they're shoulder to shoulder really has a lot of support in theory and literature on why that would actually be beneficial for people. All right, so what I've presented so far has been a really rosy picture. Games are so great. They help you connect to people. They combat loneliness. They improve your well-being. They help men talk to each other about their personal problems. But I know that most of you have actually been on the internet. So I know you know. And for those of you who aren't, you should just know that sometimes people on the interweb aren't very nice. Sometimes they don't just hang out in the New York Times comment sections. They also play games. So for the next series of things that I'll talk about, we were really looking at, can these benefits of social play be thwarted when the environment is toxic? So toxic behaviors, which consist of a lot of different types of behaviors in game and also out of game in your communication, things like hate, harassment, they're a reality of many online multiplayer games. In recent surveys, the ADL has noted that 83% of adult gamers reported that they experienced harassment in multiplayer games. And this is, of course, problematic for a number of reasons. Toxicity can ruin the game experience for everyone. It can cause psychological distress to players, particularly people from marginalized and minoritized identities. It can result in social withdrawal of the players. It can cause them to quit a game entirely, which affects the revenues of gaming companies who are built on subscription models. So it's not really good for anyone, and yet it persists. Why? So that's a question that we asked in a study that we presented at Chi 21. We conducted a mixed method study in which 106 participants were presented with different clips from the game Overwatch with low, moderate, and high toxicity. And you'll notice Elizabeth Reed's name over there. I think she's the name over there, who was part of this study and also part of the canoe study earlier that I showed. And once we had participants view these clips, and then they described their willingness to report the players that were in the clip before completing trait scales of aggression. So we looked at how aggressive they were, online disinhibition, and a construct from sports psychology, which had never been looked at in this context before, which is called moral disengagement, which describes the process by which people rationalize immoral behaviors to avoid self-condemnation. So when athletes are very competitive, when they start kind of taunting the other team, there's a process by which they might rationalize those behaviors, and that's called moral disengagement. We also had participants describe why they would not report players for toxic behavior, and we conducted a thematic analysis on those answers. The takeaway from this study was that moral disengagement and toxic online disinhibition both predicted that people would rate the toxicity clip or the clips as less toxic. So both of these traits reduced perceptions of toxicity and contributed to this normalization. But aggression didn't do anything. So I thought that was kind of interesting because there's this whole, if you follow this literature at all, there's this whole kind of debate over whether aggression is something that we need to care about in games. So we demonstrated how these different traits contribute to a cycle of normalization. And in our thematic analysis, what we revealed is that players often considered toxic content as just acceptable. They rationalized it as, oh, it's typical of games. It's part of the gaming culture. It's just banter. It's just trash talk. It's not harmful. And also not their circus or not their problem to solve. Oh yeah, well, that's somebody else's problem to deal with, the developers or the community moderators. It's not my problem to deal with. And so this led us to some research looking at whether we could predict toxicity levels during game matches using different machine learning approaches, which is something also that game industry has been doing. We again used the rated Overwatch clips and extracted the audio channel. What we did is we generated text by transcribing the communications, and we generated a set of features, which included things about the communication dynamics itself. We looked at the game metadata. We looked at semantics based on word counts that we had defined in advance. And we used these with our labels of the clips as being toxic or non-toxic to train classification models. And we could predict binary toxicity with an accuracy up to 83.9%. This work was actually led by Elizabeth as part of her honors thesis and during her undergrad, and was published last year in IEEE Transactions on Games. But the classification wasn't perfect. And part of our challenge with getting accurate results, and since we've been talking to the game industry about this since then, part of their challenge as well, is not so much about not having complex enough machine learning models to deal with this, but not being able to get accurate ideas of what is actually toxic in a gaming environment. People's perceptions of what is toxic differ quite broadly. And it differs based on a number of things. You know, are you part of this culture? Are you very familiar with games? What is your identity? And as people are exposed to toxicity over and over, they learn to rationalize its existence as just part of gaming culture. So it's normalized and it's subjective. It's changing and it's dependent on identity, which means that it's really hard to train any models to detect its presence, something that we're working with our colleagues in the games industry right now. So we started working on a different approach, one of supporting the targets of toxicity. This project, also led by Elizabeth, was presented at KaiPlay in November, and it was inspired by work done in other online contexts, like on social media, in which researchers have shown the benefit of implementing support mechanisms for people targeted by harassment. So instead of trying to punish toxic players, we're going to try to support people who are targeted. We created storyboards of different social and emotional support mechanisms and had participants rate them. And in a second study, we implemented medium fidelity prototypes in the context of an Overwatch game. And we measured the ability of the prototypes to reduce stress and improve mood. And the takeaway of all this was that all of the tools were able to somewhat increase feelings of control for the players and also help improve the mood of participants after they were exposed to a toxic clip. So to go back to the beginning a bit, our work has shown that games can help us maintain existing relationships and help us build new ones. Games can be used in this way even when our interests or abilities are vastly different from each other. And our current work also starts to look at how games satisfy our need for social connections and how to solve the threats to those benefits when the environment becomes toxic. So there was a generation of golf or bowling buddies who played together, but we're part of a new generation of clan members, guilds, and raiding parties. People used to play chess in the park, they still do, but now they also play Destiny in a mythic science fiction world. They play League of Legends in Runeterra, and they play together in the World of Warcraft. So can we harness the motivational pull of games to benefit people? Our research over the last decade suggests yes. And what I want you to take away from that part of the talk is that we should not be afraid of games as researchers, and we should not dismiss them as simply toys. Games are not the socially isolating experiences that some people claim them to be. They can be used to build new relationships, they can be used to maintain existing ones, and they also offer new opportunities for helping people satisfy their need for social interaction and their need to feel connected to other people. Which makes me feel a bit better about this situation. And as a side note, during the pandemic, these kids played online together most days. Mine were in Saskatchewan and their cousins were here in Vancouver. They played together online most days and every weekend. They played Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite, D&D. They were closer to each other than they ever have been, even though we hadn't seen each other in literal years. And when we moved out west for sabbatical last year, they started playing together in person, like the best of friends who had known each other for ages, even though they literally hadn't seen each other in person. But they built those friendships playing these games together online. So is this the whole story of my research agenda? No, absolutely not. There's so much more interesting stuff that my trainees and I have done together that I won't get into because I want to leave a bit of time for questions. But it encompasses things like looking at the benefits of gaming, the cognitive, social, emotional, and well-being and benefits of gaming. Another area of research that we've done a lot on is looking at how we can use behaviors in games as digital biomarkers of different mental health conditions, particularly focusing on social anxiety, depression, and generalized anxiety. And we've been looking at ways to use games as interventions for different mental health conditions, particularly looking at streaming as an intervention for social anxiety that's built upon the idea of exposure therapy. We've been applying all this in the context of recreational gaming, but also in the context of competitive play, where we've further been looking at the idea of what does doping mean in an esports context. And we've been looking at brain stimulation and how that affects your ability to play games. And we've been doing studies about how different substances actually affect your ability to play games and how that they should be regulated in the context of esports competitions. And we've also been looking at problematic play, obsessive passion, toxicity, and kind of these negative things that might thwart the benefits of gaming. And we've done this using a lot of experiments, which is the kind of things that I focused on today, but also looking at game analytics by looking at really large data sets from places like Steam, World of Warcraft, some Vancouver game companies as well. And recently we started partnering with Square Enix and Unity to gather some really large data sets around some of their very popular games. And to do all this, of course, we've worked on standard games user research methods, which are demonstrated in industry, and which is what my Create was about. Swagger was create a training grant, kind of like the DFP is training is a training grant, part of a research cluster. And so we've been looking at standard games user research with game companies, both indie studios and AAA studios. So where to next? Well, I've recently moved to Victoria and I start there very soon. And so I'm looking forward to building some more regional partnerships, but also pivoting my work a little. I presented mostly on social gaming technologies here today, but I also do focus on non-game technologies that support people trying to maintain and build friendships over a distance, working in collaboration with Microsoft Research and Google on those. But my goal, regardless, always remains the same: to design, develop, and evaluate novel technologies that improve the social, cognitive, and effective well-being of people. And I just want to thank my students and my colleagues. This was my lab pre-pandemic, because we never took a picture again after the pandemic, and then, or I guess we're not really after, we're still in it. And then I moved out to the West Coast. So this is the last picture I have of my lab, which was, I think, taken in 2019, maybe. And I've, talked about a small fraction of work, and I tried to name the people who did the work, but I left out entire dissertation topics on effective computing and social anxiety and persuasive computing. But I'm really grateful to have had the privilege of mentoring so many wonderful HQP or trainees over the last 15 years of my career. All right, so thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. And we're open for questions now. And I think we're prioritizing students first, then anyone else who's here in the space, and then encouraging people who are on Zoom to enter questions into the chat. And Aline is watching the chat and will be able to bring those up. So do we have any to start with?
Those diagrams you had with the nodes and the connections, I've never seen it before. Give me a brief.
Sure.
How they work.
Yeah, so
repeat questions.
yeah,
so
no problem.
hear you on.
So the question was about the diagrams with the nodes and how they work. So those diagrams were how basically we and other researchers are representing the results of a structural equation model. And it's a type of modeling approach in which you can look at not just the relationships between two nodes, but you can look at how that relationship might have an indirect pathway. And it just looks at the through nodes to another node. So that's how we would be able to say things like harmonious passion and obsessive passion both affected social capital, but only harmonious passion through social capital affected loneliness. And it really just does this by looking at the shared variance and the variance. So it's a regression-based model, if you're familiar with regressions. They're very straightforward to run. The only problem with them is that you need quite large data sets in order for them to be accurate. And they don't have any sense of causality. So you have to have some sort of a theoretical reason to believe why this node would come before that node, because it's just dealing with variance, you could just put the nodes anywhere and it would work out statistically or mathematically. So you really have to have some reason why you're putting them in a certain order. So they're not just like, a lot of kind of the stats that we use, they're correlational. There's no idea of causation in them. However, they are a very helpful tool for trying to figure out where those relationships lie so that you can do those kind of causal, experimental studies on the same topics. So structural equation modeling.
Yeah, a couple of the edges in that diagram puzzled me. I was staring, I was like, oh, that line surprises me, or something like that.
Oh, that it was significant or not?
Or which ones were red, which ones were green.
Oh, yeah. And the one diagram, the first diagram that I showed, I didn't show which paths were significant. And the other one, I think I showed only the significant paths. The red ones, I can go back to it, but the red ones were a negative correlation, like a negative relationship, and the green ones were positive. Yeah.
No, I guessed that mapping, and I was just surprised that some of them were red or something. But anyways, maybe that's a later.
I think,
discussion.
Well, and it's one of those things where loneliness is bad if it's higher, but well-being is good if it's higher. And so it's sort of like when you present results like that, you always want higher to be better. But with loneliness kind of in the mix, higher is worse. Like it's a worse thing. So to be more lonely. So it's kind of always is a little bit confusing to present, I think. Yep.
You briefly touched on game-based interventions, and I'm wondering if that's similar to gamification and like persuasive technology. I'm just wondering if your focus is kind of on games where the purpose is almost for fun on like an end goal, versus gamification, maybe the purpose is behavior change of some sort. Do the results from games that you kind of learned translate over to gamification?
It depends. So we have done a lot of work also on gamification, looking at particularly gamification of assessments of cognitive skills. So mostly we look at attentional deficits and can we assess that through gamification. So gamification, as you've correctly noted, is the application of game techniques into non-game contexts. And the idea of it is that it's supposed to improve enjoyment. It doesn't. It's supposed to improve motivation. It does a little bit. And it's supposed to improve the amount of engagement someone experiences. So there maybe we get better data with a gamified thing because people are a little bit more kind of like invested. They're putting a little bit more effort in. And that actually does happen. And so I don't know, like in terms of talking about, can we satisfy social relationships through a gamified approach as opposed to through a game? Probably, but you'd have to have something to gamify. And that's something that I'm actually looking at a little bit right now. This project I'm doing with MSR, where we're looking at networking activities for people who are distributed. And we're trying to not so much apply gamification as you might think of it, like, oh, points and themes, because that doesn't really work very well. But we're looking to apply gamification in something that you may be familiar with or may have heard of called self-determination theory. So it's that idea of what makes us really enjoy an experience. And that's the feelings of competence, feelings of autonomy, and feelings of relatedness. So if we apply those, which are very present in games, if we apply those to our other activities in ways that are very designed intentionally. So we're not kind of trying to make it more fun by making a story or by making points or making it competitive, but we're trying to make it more satisfying by increasing the feelings of competence, autonomy, and relatedness that someone feels, then that can be very effective. Yeah. So, but I think so the answer is it depends. Gamification, I try and say that word without like cringing a little because it's got a little bit of a negative connotation, I think right now, in terms of it's kind of like that chocolate covered broccoli thing about like a lot of e-learning kind of had that, or education, gamified learning had that kind of that negative association with it, that it's just throwing points and theme onto a, but there are ways to go about it quite effectively where it can actually increase investment and engagement from people using systems. So yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Or are there any online? Oh, there's one back there. Sorry? The question was, do I work with VR technology? Sorry, I forgot to repeat the other question, but I think the people online got it was about gamification. Do I work with VR technology? Yes. I personally, so the very first study I ever did was in VR as a little master's student. In my very first thing, my master's thesis was about VR in the 90s. So I really stayed away from it for a really long time because I felt like I'd been there, I've done that. But I've more recently gotten back into it. So we look at VR in particular because it has this immersion, right? So you can do things in it that are much more immersive. I personally have been using see-through VR now and augmented reality a lot more. Because I think you can do really interesting things around kind of that augmenting or experience, more like the old school view of ubiquitous computing than when you're completely, locked in. But social VR is a super interesting context, and we work with some people doing social VR at Clemson University, and it's super interesting because all the things that are terrible about the world are also terrible in social VR, and the things that are good about the world are good in social VR. And so when you're trying to solve problems, it's like you're trying to solve problems that exist in both situations, only it's that much more, like in social VR, it's just that much more easy for someone to behave in a very bad manner. And because, you have that kind of online disinhibition effect at play. So it's a really super interesting context that's growing in popularity, obviously, right now. I also get very sick in VR. So whenever my students do work in it, we have to be very careful about me trying out their systems and doing demos. I have to okay, can't eat first. I have to take the rest of the day off. I get very sick after even 10 minutes. So it's a kind of a bit of a situation with trying to do work in that context. Yeah, sorry.
So it was kind of, have you, I don't know if you assessed the same types of studies in the context that you've shown us as well as in VR, and if there's any difference, the magnitude of the relationships that you find when you're doing it in the immersive VR environment?
So not with the social connectedness stuff, but with other stuff, yes. So we have looked at We have one that we're just writing up right now that's looking at like a VR context. It was the follow on to the pinball study, actually, where we were looking at the VR context compared to a physical context compared to a desktop context. And we found a lot of similarities, basically all the similarities between the VR context and the physical context. And then the traditional kind of computer approach was like off somewhere else, not as effective at anything. So it was in that environment, it was as effective for all the things that we were looking at as the physical environment. In terms of social connectedness, no, we haven't done that yet. We had a bunch of studies ready to go around this, but then work from home and social isolation made conducting VR studies very difficult for a while. And we're just getting back into that now. Like we're just starting to run those studies again. So we were delayed by a few years there. But it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, I love the food analogy because I can totally see like junk food like game and some stigmas around it. And also games are a mixture of many ingredients, and then they can be healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah.
My question here is what I really enjoyed is how you show some ingredient to make some game healthy.
Yeah.
But I wonder how can you cook them with a good recipe to make it tasty? Because in the game industry, I think what's happening is just triggering the adrenaline and dopamine. So making game to be sellable, gaining profit. And there's a trade-off or some complicated mechanism there to motivate healthy game. So what's your thinking about that?
Great question. I don't really want to repeat the whole question because I'll miss a lot of the nuance if I summarize it. I think you got it with my mic right there. But I like the comparison between food and games. And it's interesting to me because, you never hear people talking about things like, you hear people talk about screen time, or game time. But they never talk about like food time. Oh, you're eating. Like, yeah, we eat. Like people eat. Sometimes we eat things that are good for us and sometimes we eat things that are not as good for us. But no one ever just kind of puts it all into one category like they do with games or with screens in general. And so that's exactly what we've been doing, is trying to kind of, take it apart and deconstruct it so we know what's good for you and what's not good for you. And what's simply just enjoyable. It might not be good for you, but it is actually providing you some level of enjoyment. So that's exactly what we've been trying to do. But I like your part on how to make it tasty, because that kind of goes back to that gamification question. If you remove too many elements, is it no longer fun? Is it no longer enjoyable to play games? And so that's why I think these theoretical models that really are trying to define what it is that makes games fun, because it's not what we used to think in the 90s or even in the early aughts. They're not fun just because they're fun. They're fun because they're providing us with something. They're satisfying our needs in some way. And if we can take that and separate it out from the game context, then I think that we can do a much better job of delivering what's fun for people so that they still enjoy it and they still get those benefits. Convincing the game industry of this is a little bit harder. And we're doing a project right now that I didn't talk about at all on sexualization of female characters in games. And it's really hard to deal with an industry that has these very kind of old ideas of what sells and what's necessary for players to have fun, when data is suggesting that that's not actually the case. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, I think, in terms of what makes it tasty for people. In the game industry, and in this research industry, they call it juicy. So there's lots of elements of the games that make them juicy. So audio, screen effects, those kinds of things are what makes a game very juicy and feel very like a high level of production, and call those juicy features. So, sorry.
There's a single question here. Curious to hear your thoughts on using gamification of a food application that is used to cook together and how it might serve in building connections.
So the question was about using gamification for a food application about cooking together over a distance. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that, like, in the end, the kinds of goals of cooking, of a system designed to help people cook together over a distance, and the goals of a game that people are choosing to play of their own volition are very similar. And that's that you want to have an enjoyable experience and that you want to feel connected to other people. So they actually do have a lot in common. games also have that kind of competitive element. I'm not sure Cooking Together would have that as well. But especially very popular games right now, like Valorant, Overwatch, League of Legends, Dota, have these very, competitive elements, but people are engaging in them because they're getting something out of it, particularly that feeling of competence and that feeling of being connected to others. And I think that you can really do that also in a cooking over distance situation as well. I think there's lots of different tools to connect people over a distance that can pull from the things that make games successful without becoming a game in and of itself. You could have something that doesn't look at all like a game, but still has a lot of the elements that make games successful. And I think that that's a really great example of one where you could do that, where you have guidance, you have progression, you have kind of support. Games are very well scaffolded. You have a system of working together. You have clear roles. You have good feedback. These are the kinds of things that make games really quite fun and enjoyable to play. So even if it's not juicy at all, it would still have a lot of those same elements experientially, I guess. And so I think that's something that I've been looking at a lot lately is non-game contexts as I try and pivot a little bit in my work. I know it's after time, sorry.
What was
we got
that? Most of it.
We got the wrestling situation.
Okay, I think we because we're over time, I'm gonna say that people who need to leave.
Feel free. Yeah.
We understand that you need to get up and go. We can stay in the room and continue the conversation for anyone who's able to, but just don't feel intimidated to go.
And I guess people online can always reach out to me. I'm pretty Googleable. There's not many Regan Mandryks out there.
Can I throw in a question here that hasn't come up yet, and I did want to bring it up is about toxicity.
Yeah.
And you discussed that a little bit, and you presented it as a kind of a binary. I think you were testing. I think I heard you say we tested for binary toxicity, which I understood to mean it's toxic or it's not toxic. And I was picturing watching my son's basketball games and they're trash talking each other and they're all having a great time trash talking each other.
Yeah.
It could go over the line and be too much, but there is a level of where that was exactly the behavior we're talking about, but everyone was consensual about it.
Yeah.
And or seemed to be.
Yeah.
And so I was saying, well, is like, how do you rate those things? The same behavior in a very mild level might actually be fun and okay, and then an amplified level, or for some people, it might be something different. It doesn't feel binary to me at all.
No.
And I was wondering how if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, no, it's not at all binary. We were just trying to classify it as binary as a first step. But it's not, and that's why the context matters so much, and that's why these kinds of automated detection methods are so hard because I could say the exact same thing to you and the context is different. And so in one case, it's really toxic. And in one case, it's just not. And especially the words that are used in a gaming context as well. The goal is to maybe kill other players. And so when you use words like kill or like shoot or shoot you in the face, that can actually be very positive in a gaming context. So you can't use like kind of normal, language models or bags of words to really do that. But even if you have, it's the context in which it's said, it's in the context of which it's received, and that's very subjective and it's changing. I think I said that, but it was all a part of a big thing.
I understand that the ambiguity.
And it's really,
I'm wondering how you're dealing with it.
well, the thing is that we can't create models because we can't even label things. That's why I think we moved away from that a little bit. You can't create, I'm sure that there are machine learning models that will work. I'm positive that we can create models
You could label them.
if we could label things, but we can't label things. And this is something that's not just for us. It's the problem with, so the people that we're working with at Google have the same problem. They're trying to do online labeling of, online hate and harassment, and they can't because it's very subjective. And there was a paper at CSCW this year that showed, based on the identity of the rater, vast differences. So I, as someone who identifies as female, might feel very differently about something that's said than someone who doesn't identify as female, or a player of color or whatever. So those identity factors, but also like things like my age might play into it, or my self-efficacy, or my confidence, or the reason that I'm there in the first place, and all these things come at it. And on top of all that, as time goes on, it gets normalized. So it gets normalized to trash talk in ways that are over the line, and that becomes under the line, and the line moves. So it's quite mind-blowing to think that how we're going to solve this. And so that's made me think that the approach is not necessarily more classification, but the approach might be more intervention. So how do we intervene in gaming communities to not just support the targets, which was what Elizabeth was working on, but also to promote positive play behaviors, to generate more empathy, And this is something that
Consciousness.
consciousness, yeah.
But then you have to be interested in.
Well,
like if
this is
you're
the approach
trying
that
to
electronic arts is
intimidate
trying to
someone.
take. That's what they're trying to do, is this positive play initiative, as opposed to some of the other companies who are trying more still to just combat toxicity, but people just get around the models all the time anyways, the detection methods.
Oh, they have another input and.
I don't play games, so when I saw your talk description, I was quite pessimistic about it, like in terms of me being engaged.
Yeah.
In the talk, but I actually was feeling quite engaged in the talk, and I appreciate you kind of showing the other aspects of games. And my question is, like your research suggests that games can contribute to sense of social connectedness and sense of trust. And I wonder whether this effectiveness of games in terms of these contributions was also compared to effectiveness of other non-game methods.
Yeah.
For example, shared activities, shared experiences, and so on. And whether you can comment on effectiveness of different kind of modalities.
Well, the series of studies that we did on trust, we did compare to a non-game method, and a very standard method of developing trust between two strangers. So kind of the gold standard. But again, these are just experiments, so they're at a moment in time. And we haven't done any work in this context where we've embedded ourselves in teams over the long haul. We kind of just, the PhD student moved on to, he went to work for Facebook or something. And then, like the work moved on. So we haven't looked at kind of what that looks like in reality over time, kind of more longitudinally. But we did compare to non-game approaches. And other people have, so other work, my colleagues have done work looking at similar things for things like stress reduction, where they would compare to a mindfulness app, for example. And they've shown that games were more effective in that case than the mindfulness app at helping people disengage from noxious moods as a result of terrible days at work. And there's lots of reasons theoretically why that's the case that I can't, I don't have time to get into right now, but games do a really good job of helping people recover from stress. But in terms of how we might kind of do, there's always this problem with these kinds of apps and games, that what do you compare it to? And you can compare it to something like personal information exchange. But if we compared a game to a sports team, I'm not sure that you'd see many differences, but maybe you would, because there's so much depth in a sports team coming together to train and to learn and to get better at something and to work as a team and to communicate and then to compete against another team. There's so much depth there. And over time, that's like really important for helping people feel connected to one another. And if those same things are happening in the context of the game, I could see that there might not be any difference, but we tend to compare to things that are a little more easy to access, right? So things like, engaging in a non-game activity like personal information exchange or like a mindfulness app or like, something that's a little bit more comparable. Sorry?
Compartmentalize.
Yeah, where you can sort of take the things that are different. So I think that there are activities that are probably much more effective at facilitating social connections in games. It's not like we're comparing, developing trust between two strangers online with like a marriage, but like those are two very different things, but we are comparing it to something that's kind of in the same vein. And so we're seeing really, really positive effects of games in those contexts. So I think it really depends. And I also think that there's something to be said about that long-term part of it. I don't really need to get into it now, but there's things that might happen in the short term that are fine. But in the long term, we lose something. And this is something that we're seeing, for example, with distributed meetings. As we replace face-to-face meetings with distributed meetings, in the short term, it's working out okay. But, when you look back, 10 years later, there's stuff that's lost as a result of having made that shift for climate reasons or for accessibility reasons or for whatever reason. And you don't see those losses until, 10 years have gone by and you realize all the things that people aren't getting out of those meetings were supposed to achieve. And I think the same thing is going to be true in this context as well. I think that we'll see, in a decade, we'll see maybe some interpersonal skills that Gen Z don't have. Or we'll see things that they do better, but we'll also see things that are missing.
Making a phone call versus texting.
Yeah.
About texting, but they have difficulties making phone calls.
Yeah. Or something like that. Yeah. But I think it's, again, there'll be things that are better. There'll be things that are worse.
maybe we can take one more on Zoom.
Perfect. Hannah, she's asking about toxicity, how has the cultural narrative shifted in games user research since the era of #Gamergate toxicity to how it has manifested and is understood for players now?
It's a great question. So the question for those of you that didn't hear at the back was about how have things changed since Gamergate. Things have changed a lot since Gamergate, both for good and for bad. So I think Gamergate made everyone a lot more aware of the real dangers and harms of some of the, more what people thought were benign forms of toxicity, but also some of the more extreme forms of toxicity like doxing, and how much it is grounded in this kind of developing incel culture, which is something that we've been looking at as well. I think it's also made people a lot more scared to touch. So researchers might be scared to talk about toxicity or scared to work on toxicity because there's real world harms that can come to somebody if those bad actors on the internet decide to take them on. If you publish a paper that says something about, women in games or people of color in games or, LGBTQA people in games, you can get attacked as a result of that online and then even, doxing in person. So I think it's changed things in really negative ways, but I think it's also become people have become more aware. So just like with Gamergate, with Me Too, with all sorts of these movements where things have come to the light, I think people are now more believing that it exists and that it's a problem and it's something that we have to solve. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a tough one. It's a really tough one. I sometimes think about it too, it's pretty tough watching what people are going through when they raise these as issues that are something to be solved. Yeah, on that note.
There's big challenges for us all to work on. It's really inspiring.
Just as a final thing, if you are working on this area or interested in this toxic area, we're running a workshop at CHI on it. So feel free to join us. You don't even have to be working on the area, just interested if you're attending CHI in Hamburg.
CHI is in
Oh, sorry.
in Hamburg.
All right, sorry.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks again.